但是他这还是蛮好，下课还是很。
I'm not going to pick out individual examples this time. I'd just like to get some idea from you guys what was what you thought about it, what was hard and what was difficult, and we can work around that. I also want to highlight a thing about doing posts because we didn't really get a chance to do an example of that last week, and I think there was some in doing the task it seemed like there was a little bit of confusion as to what the real goal of doing a post is. Okay, right. So how did we get on to it? What did we notice? Did we all manage? Like, who managed to do the task? Whose group managed to do the task? Okay. Were there any questions about it? Was there anything that you weren't sure about?
I didn't understand the instruction, Mickey. You know, you talk about with the accept language and the accept. So I don't understand whether that was something that you wrote into the HTML document,
Okay.
or Jermaine to give,
Yeah.
or whether that was a request to the document,
Yeah.
or whether there had to be something in the document that could
Yeah,
respond
we didn't
to the
get it.
request. But I did sort of try and answer your question, but I didn't think I asked it very well. I did email you, but
Okay.
I probably asked it in that half about it didn't make sense.
So these are something called headers. These are part of both the request and the response of your HTTP. So there's no HTML involved in here other than maybe the body will be returned as HTTP. This is all part of that request.
Yeah, I know, that's fine. That's what I couldn't get. I just
Yeah, so
get
it's definitely part of the request.
Live?
And in fact, let's have a look at that in Postman. Different example. What was the title of it? Get different names. Examples. Right. Someone give me an example of a site that gives you back a different language.
Google.
So give you a different language?
eBay.
eBay, right. Let's try eBay.
Spanish, didn't it? I don't know where.
eBay. So
Yeah.
if we get eBay.com, eBay.com, it's all very nice. ASCII art in the source. When we get that and preview it, we'll get the English version. You can tell by the text in there that we've got the English version. What accept language does, and the way you send it is you go to this, the headers here. So there are various parts that you can add to your initial request. The key bit is the URI, which method you're using, but you can attach various aspects to this. For example, I don't know why that's in there by default. We might add a header to tell the server that we're communicating with various things that we want to affect this request. And accept language is a really good example of that. So the idea is that your client, the software that you're requesting from, so typically your browser, will know what your preferred language is. And that means it can, when it sends each of the HTTP requests, it can indicate to the server what language it would like, what human readable language it would like that data back in, if it's available. So you then have a system called content negotiation, this process is called content negotiation, where the server will do its best to fulfill some of these requirements, but it will have like a fallback. So if it's a site that doesn't support French language, but you request French language, then it'll tend to send you back what it has.
You actually do wonder, because we tried to do it, in there, but it just couldn't get any sensible
language. And the values that you need to use are sort of the country code.
Yeah, like C1, yeah, like
Is French just
FR, yeah.
like that? Nothing. Who said eBay works?
Headers.
Sorry?
Headers. If you.
There.
No, the headers.
The headers. Yeah, it will change.
It says the content in French.
Yeah.
It's not in French.
Very nice size. Visual is come.
We found this with places that seem to present us with a different URI for languages, as opposed to using accept language.
Yeah. So that happens sometimes.
This didn't
It's
seem
probably quite tricky. Oh no, don't go to my Facebook. There we go.
Uh-oh.
That's why we changed to Google for it to work.
So during my example of this that's on the site, I didn't do an except language because it's one of the it's not always that well supported. You'll find some sites that support it, but it's not
The only way you get something different back was, for example, someone who's Welsh. So there's a Welsh university that's got an English site and a Welsh site. But the only way you could get it to respond back with the Welsh was to actually in the URI was to put forward /C, was it CY for Welsh?
Well, W actually in the URI because it didn't support the language.
Yeah, so the only way was actually to go to the URI that had the Welsh website rather than
Because the server didn't recognise it.
because the server wouldn't accept language.
Yeah, so again, it's entirely down to the whether the server supports that and whether it has content.
Okay, so if one was wrong, we would just couldn't get anybody to it work.
Yeah.
How do you find out which codes to use to get different languages? Because
Sorry,
how do you get the language codes in the first place? Because they can't all use country codes.
There's a list.
I think this was probably similar to a question that I had in relation to our group thing. Is there like a central repository for things like headers? Because we found we had to dart across a lot of different places to find out things like telnet and language codes. So is there a central one or?
Sorry, is there a central one?
Yeah, for like language codes and a repository that covers those kinds of things.
You will have to trace through from the RFC. So there is a thing in network tech called a request for comments, and pretty much everything that's like internet and web related gets standardized to begin with through these. So when someone when they propose HTTP, when they propose HTTP 1.1, all the different extensions to that, each of the new headers and things that they get added, someone will write an RFC for that. Find the RFC for accept language, and then from that it will tell you what the list is for this. And it looks like it's the IANA country code list, and that will give you the authoritative list of what languages are available. But again, in this case, it's a challenge to find a suitable example that uses language. But there are sites out there that do it. I guess the thing is to look for sites that have a sort of international audience and try and find them that way. A better source for trialing this content and negotiation are the content type. Hang on, that's not the school, is it? And the user agent headers, because far more websites will alter their responses based on that. So user agent is a string that your client, your browser, uses to identify itself when it communicates with the server. Yeah. Is it about this? Is it about user agent?
No.
Okay. Should we come back to it?
Focusing on headers quite a lot, but when you say
there was a question about headers, that's why I pushed about headers.
But say we were to be sending HTTP requests, the most likely situation would be when communicating with an API, and in that case we'd be using parameters and not headers. There are
Not
reasons
necessarily.
why.
Headers are
For example, if you were to contact the IBM Watson API, if you wanted to change the output from say JSON to XML, you would use a parameter and not a header.
That is because it is a terrible use of HTTP. That is a bad API. So we'll talk about this in when we start talking about REST. But yes, that happens in practice, but it's not particularly good use of the power of HTTP, and that's why I'm telling you about the power of HTTP. The point of these headers is that you can use them as part of the HTTP spec to make requests of that kind, and not pollute the other places that shouldn't be for that purpose. So polluting the URI full of explaining what content type you want and things like that, when you could use a header, is bad practice. It's not to say that lots of APIs don't do that. They absolutely do. But it's not considered best HTTP practice. So yeah, ones that are good examples. User agent is a really good example for a header that will have a big impact, mostly because it's how most websites will detect whether you're using a mobile browser or a desktop browser, and it's from that they'll redirect you to content that's mobile specific or desktop specific. You get a bit less of that these days because we have CSS that will modify a page to work on either, or display on either called in a move called responsive design, or a metaphor for building sites. And that means like fewer of them will respond to user agent. But now that but there's so many people that had built websites that responded to user agent, there's still a bit of a hangover of that. And yeah, so the example of it's not content type, it's accept. So the modifying what type of data you get back tends to be down to the accept header. Did Nick talk about headers? Did you talk about them in the lecture on HTTP? Can you give some examples? Okay, so I'm not just, this isn't all new. So yeah, in terms of picking what type of data, the interesting thing here is the real theoretical thing behind accept is that you can ask for a resource and it can give it back to you in like any number of different file formats if the server supports giving you that data back in different types. So it might be that you represent the unique resource, which might be I don't know, it might be, let's say it's a paper, like an academic paper. Now there's multiple formats that could be in, both technical and, well, they're all digital formats, but both in sort of markup, so you could request that paper back in HTML, and you might do that with saying that your accept header is text HTML. But you might also want to request that in PDF. You might want to request it as a JPEG, like an image of that paper. You might even, like this sounds like out of the realms of possibility because people don't do it, but you might even request it as audio. So you could imagine having an audio recording of an academic paper, but fundamentally it's the same resource. The thing you're asking for is that paper. You're asking for that content, and what accept header lets you do is select which format you get that back in. And the server then does what it can. A lot of the time, it will just have something in HTML, like in text HTML or in JPEG if it's an image. But the idea is that the HTTP spec supports this idea of being able to negotiate what type of content you get using the headers. So whether you might tell it which languages you accept, which formats you accept, and what user agent you use. Okay. What we haven't spoken about, so just to address the issue of communicating things through the URI string, we will talk about that when we do REST APIs. So there is other information that you're sending to the server, and again there are best practices about what should go in there and what you can communicate through the URI. The very purest thing being that the URI should just represent the resource and not necessarily any of the data going to it. But it's very much one of those, like there are purists and there are pragmatists, and there are sort of different ends of the spectrum as to what they actually want to do. Right, we didn't really cover post last week, and I'd like to quickly speak about that. I'm going to give an example of that. Let's get that on the screen. So the key point of post is it allows you to send data to the server. So let's pick up that example. There we go. So the example I'm going to use is a website called Imgur. It's an image hosting website. They have an API. The API URI is api.imgur.com/image. And this is a resource, this is an endpoint where you can post data to, and as long as you provide the right information, so you provide the data from a file, an image file, and you provide it's a sort of authorization header, it will post it to your account on Imgur. Are you still copying my client ID?
Oh, I've got the glasses on.
Don't read it. Right, we're on there. So, right, the key thing here is that when we do a post, it allows us to attach data to it. So Postman lets you do this as a file attachment. Also, as part of the body, you can send data from forms. So if you've been on a website and there is like a text box and check boxes and stuff like that, when you select that, when you input that information and click send, it is doing a HTTP post, collecting that data together, putting it in a format that the web server is going to understand, and then sending that over the HTTP request. And there's two forms for that, form data and XWW form URL encoded. But we're going to send a binary file to Imgur because that's what it expects. And as I said before, this particular one requires a special header that does some authorization. And effectively this is authenticating me as my account, so it'll post to my Imgur API account for a test run. I can't remember what I did. So when we do this, so we've attached that to giraffe.jpg. I'll prove that exists. So that is this file. Okay. And what happens when we do that is if we send that post, something might actually happen. Work. We didn't have. And that responds with some data in a format called JSON. I don't think you've been shown JSON yet, have you? Or explicitly. You'll see it's a lot. I guess we should probably talk about it when we talk about REST, because we will. You'll come across it quite a lot. It is a sort of hierarchical data format, not unlike XML. The person who writes the data gets to choose what all the elements and values, or the elements are. The values are of either string or numerical, or lists or groups, or some of these object type things. Go and look it up. It's a useful format. It's a very popular format these days. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's based on that JavaScript language. And what's in here are a bunch of key value pairs. So there's a property name, then a colon, then a value. And the one that's useful to us is this one here, which is the link. So it's told us a bunch of stuff about that image that we uploaded. So it's told us it's not animated. It's told us the width and the height. It's told us how many views we've had. We've not had any views on that yet. That's very disappointing. Whether it's not safe for work, and so on. All things that are properties of their website. And it's also given us a link to that. And this is on their actual live domain. I don't run this domain, so I'm using their API to do it. And if we go to that URL and hit enter in the browser, we'll see that was the photo that we just uploaded. So it has in that process, it's taken the file that we've sent it, it's stored it on their server, and then it has returned in the response to us the link to that new file. Now the important thing there is that was that bit in the send where we were putting information into the body. The point of the post is being able to send information to the server that gets used by the server. And I saw a fair few examples in the submissions that were posting nothing to home pages of websites, and that has, like, in a lot of cases the site will just respond in the same way as if it had been a GET request. But that's not the purpose of a post. A post is to send information to the server and to send it to that particular resource. I'm interested. Did you guys hear about put as well?
Yeah.
Did you get something about put? Well, again, we'll talk about in more detail with REST. But there's a bit of a semantic difference between those to be careful of. Where put is put tends to be used that the resource already exists and you're putting something in that location. So you know the URI of the exact resource and you're putting something on it. So that's normally for like editing in the existing resource. So if we wanted to change this resource to be a different photo of a giraffe or that photo of a giraffe with glasses on, and then we might put to this to that URI. Post tends to be for generating new things, so you'll post to a more generic URI such as /image, and it will create a resource and tell you what that resource is. And that's what's happened here. When we did a post, it created a new URI and sent that back to us. So again, we'll talk about that when it comes to doing REST soon. John?
On the post front, I mean, we wrote a view, I think, as a team, that if it rejects our post request to somewhere like Google, that in itself is demonstrative of post. Is that an acceptable thing to show? I mean, you mentioned we were probably one of the groups that said, well, the post wasn't accepted, which is the intention, because most websites like ECS wouldn't want you to overwrite all the content or upload a given image over a given thing.
It was interesting that you noticed that there was a, I guess that's worth pointing out, you noticed that on some sites when you did a post, you'd get a response back saying that it wasn't a supported method. So you've got, can anyone remember what the code was?
5, wasn't it?
I thought it was 405. So it was 405 error, was it content not, method not supported?
We had 2 different errors from 2 different sites.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you remember what the other one was?
I'll just have a look if I can find the thing.
So there is the opportunity for the web server to deny access to a particular method. Most of them will accept GET. It'll be an old website to find where it doesn't let you get the resource. But sometimes with some of these more methods that enact change, they might deny access to it. They might say, actually, you can't post it here because we don't want to receive your data. I think the likely reason Google are doing that is to avoid sort of nefarious attacks where people try and post huge amounts of data to their site and have to try and take a web server down by overwhelming it with massive data sizes and requests. So my intention, what I was hoping was with the post request that you'd be sending information to the site and seeing what sort of response you got back from that, whether it was just a new result, like a page that displayed that information, or as we saw with Imgur, it gives you a new resource that represents that information. Right, I think, are there any other questions, HTTP? I'll have a quick go on CSS before we go.
We got a 400 error indicating that it was forbidden. Malformed or illegal request, it was 400, and 405.
Yeah.
Those are the 2, I believe.
Was 400 forbidden or
400 indicated that your client issued a malformed or illegal request.
okay. So it might have been that it
Google
hadn't constructed it correctly. Okay.
as well, in that it specifically in the title.
Okay. Yeah, bad request. So that means it malformed there was probably a different error within the construction of the setup there. Right, what we're going to do for the last 10 minutes is have a look at some CSS. I am going to validly plagiarize this HTML document so we don't have to write one from scratch from the W3C website and their tutorial on CSS. And what we're going to do is mark up, is style some of this interactively, I think. So, given this HTML document, we are going to do some styling. That document was here. So, in our most basic form, we have this document. On the right, and when we render it, it looks like this on the left. So, I guess, what's the first thing we want to do? Can you see that? What are our elements? Help me discover what elements we've got in there, and then we'll start doing some styling on them. I will take any suggestions for what elements we've got in this document.
H1.
H1, yeah. what does that do?
It's just a header.
It is a heading, so like the title of the section. Next one.
Title.
Title, yep. Where's that? That's up there, isn't it? Okay. So title's interesting because it's metadata, because it's in the head tag. We can't really style it because it's not displayed. Another one. We've got others. There is an address at the bottom. Yep. So I've slightly obscured that. Address. Very good. Another one.
Unordered list.
Unordered list. Very good. That's here. So UL unordered list. And that has an associated element. What's inside the unordered list?
And that's where it is next.
Yeah, list item, so LI, so each of the bits in it, and, sorry?
Link.
Oh, anchor, yep. A tag, anchor. Yeah, anything else we got in there? There's one that there's loads of. Paragraph, very good. Yep, so these are I think that's all of our elements. So there's a body element and an HTML element around that. But let's skip over those for now. Well, they're not. The body tag is stylable, but the what's it called isn't. So right, I'm not going to show you in element styling, but we are going to have a look at. Let's do some in document styling, so we're all in one place. So the way we do this is with a style tag. So we open and close style tag, and everything that goes inside here will be CSS code. It will be CSS in the format that we spoke about CSS in yesterday's lecture. Now, the structure for that, can anyone remind me, what's the structure of a CSS statement? What are the things that we need to do?
Selector.
Yeah, so we need a selector first, and in the first instance that's likely to be an element name, so let's style H1. Then what do we have? Yeah, a curly bracket open and a curly bracket closed. Because they have to open and close, it's worth putting both in at the same time. And then what goes in there? What goes in between those curly brackets?
Your style.
Property and value, absolutely. Right, what property are we going to change? Someone pick a property.
Color.
Font style.
Font, yeah.
Right, that was the first one.
Font size.
Style. So you have the property name, then a colon, then some value. What values can font style have, sir?
Roman. Font style. Euro.
Is that right? I'm sure that's not font weight.
That is font weight. Font style is italic, whatever.
Yeah. Italic. There we go. Why did I set it to italic? Yeah, that's right. You can say. Okay, so the effect of that was that all of the H1s in this page, which is only that one, we've changed the font style to italic. So we've changed what that one looks like. If we wanted to make it, it's already bold, so if we wanted to make it not bold, so font weight is how you make it bold. If I put that in, we'll see that it has no effect. In fact, it's sometimes worth looking at inspect element. I'll talk about this in a second, because you can see what the default is for any attribute in there. So each element has a default CSS styling already. That's why they all look slightly different. So a heading always looks a little bit different to a paragraph and so on, because there's some default styling. If you look in the inspector, which is one of your most helpful tools for this part of your task, this part of your life, it is a piece of an aspect of your browser that lets you look at the HTML, the DOM, and the CSS, amongst other things, that make up your page, and interact with them. So this, in Chrome, you get to it by right-clicking somewhere in your page and going to Inspect Element, and it will then select that element in the page. It's also quite useful because it will highlight the things that you're hovering over. But if we look at H1, we can see that there's a user agent style sheet. User agent style sheet is this browser style sheet that's the default for this, and we'll see that by default the font weight is bold. But we can, if we're feeling cheeky, change that. So, anyone know what we do if we want it to be not bold, unbold? Normal, yeah. So we can in fact convince that to be not bold when it was bold in the first place. So now we've switched the default styling of that out of bold and into just italic and not bold.
Very specific reasons why you're using words instead of numbers.
Words instead of the numbers?
Yeah, like as in, for example, one way you can put like 800 or like bold instead of like
What does 800 mean?
well, from my understanding of it, it just makes font bolder.
Really, really bold. But what are the scales of that?
No idea.
Does it actually have any effect?
You can put 100, yeah. But I think the maximum is 800.
Yeah. Doesn't seem to be having any.
So you can go from like between 800 to 300.
It might have been deprecated. It did used to work.
Doesn't seem to be having much effect. I'm not using it because it doesn't seem to work. It's also like typically people want to turn things bold on or off. You're right. There is scope for being able to have minor adjustments within this. That tends to be more useful within things like doing spacing and bordering and margins and stuff like that. To have really fine control over that. Okay, right. Let's look at another element. Right. Element. What element should we style next? Let's style the address. We're going to style the address. So, what should we try out? I think we should put the border around the address. The border is an interesting one because the border, by default, is a compound. So you can define each of the borders individually, and within each of the borders, you can define a bunch of different parts of that separately. So you can define like the thickness of the border, the colour of the border, the style of the border, whether it's dashed or dotted and so on. What do I want? I'm going to get the ordering wrong here. Okay, so it's most basic, and the colours as much of this as we need for a basic example. With border, we set the thickness of the border, we set the type of line it is, so whether it's dashed or not. In this case, we've gone for solid, and then the colour. So if we change the value at the end, and it's sort of an interesting, slightly odd syntax because suddenly the thing on the right-hand side isn't just one value; it's a series of values that set different parts of this style. And they're not separated by commas or anything like that, like you might expect for a list. They're just separated by spaces, which I've always thought was a little bit strange. The thing that you notice once you put a border around something is actually everything crushes right up against the border. By default, the gap between the content of the border is 0. At that point, it's useful to realise or know about the padding attributes. You see, we can, as well as there being borders and paddings for affecting every single one around the box model, we can also address certain ones. So if we want to address just the padding left, we can change that too. And padding's a size, so you put a number in here, and you put a measurement, or sorry, like a measurement type. So I think, did we see some of those yesterday? So you can do sort of real-world measurements. So we can go for 1 centimetre, and when we refresh that, we'll get something that's meant to be 1 centimetre. That looks slightly more than 1 centimetre on my screen. The idea behind those real-world measurements is the browser is meant to have an idea of the dimensions of your monitor, the dimensions and the resolution of the monitor, and work out how many pixels that would that was made up to give you 1 centimetre. We can do it in pixels as well. So pixels are the number of the small dots that you see when you get really, really close to the TV screen or your monitor, when you're like falling asleep late at night and you get so close that you can see the dots. Each of those dots are pixels, and they're a measurement that we can use in here. So if we know that we want something to be a certain number of pixels away, we use px. But one that's really useful and means, well, has a special meaning is EM, the M size. And that is a relative size. That is a size that is the width of the M character in the current font. So that means if the font changes and the M is much narrower, the value that this is worth alters because of it. But it also means that if your font size changes, as in it gets bigger because the user has zoomed in and zoomed out, then that will also have an effect. So if we refresh that, let's do an example. So if we make this
它是一个
10 pixels,
相对的是吧？
refresh that. As we zoom, that won't really change size. But if we make it 1 EM, it should scale with the size of the font.
相对的。
1 EM. That's a terrible demo, that hasn't worked at all. But yeah, EMs are useful because they allow you to make things with relative sizing rather than just absolute sizing. Right, what else did we see in terms of displaying these things? Are there any suggestions from the audience? Any particular things that you want to see? Yeah, go on. Go wild.
Maybe something like, I don't know, H1 hover, and then add something value to it.
What styling should we do?
Background color, blue.
Oh yeah, background color might be a good idea. So this is a bit of syntax we didn't see yesterday, but one of the other special selectors is that you're able to react to events within your CSS as well. So :hover says that when the mouse is physically located above the paragraph tag, then it will apply this style. When that's not the case, when that's not true, so when the mouse moves off, then it reverts back to its previous style. So in fact, we can have two styles. We can have a P by default, and that's the background color. Could be red, and then when we hover, it's going to be blue. So let's refresh that. So red by default. And then when we hover over it, then it changes to this. I didn't realise you guys were actually straight out.
I'm not entertaining myself.
Sorry?
I'm entertaining myself back here.
You'll entertain us on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just going to be this for the rest of the course. We're going to come in and do
Make it yellow!
request from the audience. I don't like it. Okay, right. The thing with this though is there are so many different CSS properties that you can use to style, and obviously there are all the different forms of elements, and they have like particular. There's a certain styling that is more useful for certain elements. So we didn't look at the list, but the list is a good opportunity to sort of use that to do interesting styling, and use that to use particular styling to like. So with the list tag, it's not something you'd really do for anything else, but with the list tag, you can both change what those are at the beginning. So you can change the bullet points to be different bullet points, but you can also remove them. You can even do things like make that list not run horizontally. You can make the list run vertically. Sorry, not vertically, run horizontally. Because it's still a list. If it's conceptually a list, you should still use unordered list and LI items. But if you want it to display vertically, you're going to have to change the styling of that because by default it will run vertically. And you'll see like that was used quite a lot for sort of building menus on web pages. So if you look at the source for a lot of sites that have a menu across the top, a lot of that menu will be a list. And if you view it without any source, without any CSS, so if you turn off the CSS styling, then you'll see it displays as this. In fact, you may have even noticed it, like if you've got a slow internet connection, things like the BBC website, when it first loads, you'll notice the links that are normally across the top of the page display like that until the CSS kicks in and the browser renders it, and suddenly they're red and they're big and they've got big font and they run horizontally, and that's all just due to the CSS. But in terms of data structure, it's a list, so it should be stored in the document as a list, regardless of what that default styling is. So again, it's that sort of it's trying to realise that separation where we put it in that format because we want it to be structured that way, but we can use CSS to completely change how that displays. Okay, right, I'm going to wrap up there. The task, let me show you the task, just because it's quite interesting, I think. There is a website called CSS Garden. And we're going to get you to take the HTML file from this and write your own CSS for it. CSS Garden is interesting because it is a resource that has the exact same web page, like hundreds or maybe even thousands of times, just with different CSS. So this is the home page, but we'll look at an example, we'll look at a couple of examples. That is exactly the same content, but with different CSS. And this is also exactly the same content. It looks like it's got some JavaScript as well, maybe some CSS3, just different CSS. And exactly the same content, right? Exactly the same content, different CSS. And it's fun to have a bit of a browse around it to see get the idea of all the different types of layout and types of styling you can do. And feel free to go into the CSS of each of those pages and see how they did particular bits. That whole, where was this one? The right-clicking on something and inspecting elements so you can figure it out could be super useful to try and work out what's going on in the CSS there. And yeah, I want you not to don't take one of the ones that are already there. I want you to write your own one from scratch as a group, but go wild and put whatever styling in there that you want.
Does it have to be responsive?
It does not have to be responsive. We haven't really spoken about responsiveness, but feel free to do what you want with it. If you want to demonstrate responsiveness, you want to practice it, then go for it. I'm expecting you to be responsive now, Doctor. One last thing. We've had some requests for additional support with the HTTP. If you're interested in something like that, can you come down to the front and I'll see if I can take some names and arrange a support session with one of our postgrads. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
有了呀。